Now let's do an overview of the Mega Man X series. Just like with my overview of the original series, this is not going to be a deep dive into each game, just an overview of the series as a whole. And let's start with the original 3 games on the Super Nintendo. Now in many cases, I don't usually believe in the adage that every sequel of a game or a movie or something is always worse than the original. However, in the case of the X series, I do have to say that the original Mega Man X is probably objectively the best game in the series. Building up on the experience they had already gathered from Mega Man's 1 through 5, X is just an action-packed game with kick-ass music, great levels, and great bosses. It gets so many things right, it doesn't really feel unfair at any point. So much care has been put into the design of it. It's truly a fun pick-up-and-play experience. Even on your first playthrough, it is possible to actually beat most of the bosses, which are called Mavericks, just with your normal weapon. I do think it's a bit annoying that you do have to go to Chill Penguin stage in order to get the dash at the beginning, but beyond this little hiccup, the rest of the game is really excellent. The soundtrack in particular, I personally think the soundtrack is actually better than in Mega Man 2, which had easily the best soundtrack of the original series. Unlike Mega Man 1 in the original series, this absolutely is a good game to start if you've never played a Mega Man X game before. Now, X2 is my least favorite entry of the Super Nintendo installments. Now, it does have some minor improvements. For instance, you get the dash right from the get-go. And I do think that the opening is really cool in this one, but for some reason I've never really liked this one. In this game, aside from beating the Robot Masters, you're also going up against the X-Hunters on your quest to regain the parts of Zero, your friend who died at the end of the first game, and who became a playable character in subsequent installments. The thing about X2 is that none of the levels are particularly fun. The soundtrack is okay, but only a few of the tunes really stick out, but mostly I really just don't like the boss roster in this one. The bosses in the first X game were kinda weird, themed around different animals, but here we have a truly weird collection, which includes animals like moths and snails, a centipede, and of course, a wire sponge. Yup. Now a few of the levels have kind of funny gimmicks, but I just never really found this one very appealing. It's not a bad game, it's just not very memorable. Alright, Mega Man X3, I've already made a review video for this one specifically, so you all should probably know that this is my second favorite game in the series, but make no mistake, this one is not for beginners. In fact, it is brutally hard, with enemies respawning at a deadly frequency. A lot of the levels are very treacherous, and although at least a few of the bosses are beatable with just your normal weapon, many of them are really difficult to fight against. This is also the first game where you actually are allowed to play as Zero. Unfortunately, you can only really play 1/3 of any level as him, because for some reason, Zero can't open doors. However, the soundtrack is really nice and kickin', with some of the sound samples being maybe a little messy, but overall, I really enjoy this one, but definitely do not jump into this one if you haven't played the previous X games. It's not very beginner-friendly. Then we come to the entries on the PlayStation, X4 through 6. Now, Mega Man X4 came out around the same time as Mega Man 8, and a feature these games share, along with the sequels, is that every time you die, your Master Weapon energy actually goes back up. In this game, you get to choose whether to play as X or Zero, but unfortunately you cannot switch characters in the middle of the game after this point, unlike in the sequels. Not that it matters, because playing as Zero in this game is pretty terrible, on account that he does not get an arm cannon. Meaning that some of the bosses, which are actually pretty easy to beat as X, are pretty brutal and difficult as Zero, because you have to go up to them in order to attack them. The game has a nice graphic look, though a few of the stages have maybe unflattering color choices. The soundtrack's pretty laid back, but I feel it fits the game well. It's not very memorable, but it's still pretty fun. This game does, however, have one of the most annoying vehicle stages from the entire series, and although there are anime cutscenes, I gotta be honest, I've never really been a big fan of these. I know there's a lot of people out there who really like this game, and I do think a lot of the bosses are pretty interesting, including Cyber Peacock, Magma Dragoon, and Split Mushroom. Yes, there's a mushroom as a boss in this game. Also, difficulty-wise, it's actually very beginner-friendly, which is why it's a game I could actually recommend for first-time players. But I would still easily pick X1 or 3 over this one. Now, X5, however, is probably my third favorite game in the series, but it is definitely not for beginners. In this game, a space station is hurtling towards the Earth, threatening all life. So the game has a kind of time limit divided into hours, which basically equates to you either beating a level or getting a game over. But the truth is, if you fail at a level and want to try another one, it's easier to just reload an older save. So the time limit in itself is not really much of a hitch. In this game you are allowed to choose between X and 0, and you even get the armor from the previous game from the get-go, which can help you with some of the tougher levels. X5 is admittedly very challenging, but it has a lot of options that allow you to make the game a lot easier if you want to, including the armor, which I already mentioned. Also, there's a high level of randomization in the game's story, and there are even multiple endings, which is kind of a cool feature. I personally just love the levels and the background music. The bosses are pretty cool, though sadly in the Legacy Collection you no longer get the funny Guns N' Roses names that these characters used to have. However, there are some gimmicky levels, and I will admit not all of them are really that much fun. The first half of Old Kraken's level is a vehicle stage, for instance, and I will admit that Duff McWhalen's or Tidal Whale's level isn't a whole lot of fun, but the rest of them I actually do enjoy, which is the reason why this game, in my view, is quite a lot of fun. So if you can sink your teeth into this one, I think you're gonna have a good time with it. But then came Mega Man X6, and oh my god, this game is some shit. It might easily be the worst Mega Man game ever made. Now it does feature a lot of the same features as the previous game, but whereas only some of the levels in X5 had gimmicks in them, X6 is almost entirely consisted of gimmicks, and they are really frustrating. There's a level where you can wall jump, there's a level where there's just shit flying at you from every corner. In fact, 2 such levels. There's a level where you basically just fight the same mini-boss over and over again. I mean, needless to say, this game just feels like a grind, and it's really not any fun to play. Only the couple of normal levels in the game are at all fun, and the rest is just an awful mess. There are just so many cheap deaths and just generally awful level design. Even though a few of the background themes are kinda nice, this game is just not enjoyable at all. And lastly, we come to the entries on the PlayStation 2, X7, and 8. Now, X7 was the most ambitious of the Mega Man X titles, as it tried to bring the game to 3D, at least for the most part. It introduces a new playable character, Axel, and while X6 is admittedly a shit game, this game is extremely divisive in the Mega Man fan community, and I can see why. Now don't get me wrong, I personally like the 3D gameplay myself, but it's also pretty obvious to me that Capcom also put in a lot of side-scrolling segments because they felt a little self-conscious about the game changing style so much. And yes, you do unfortunately only get to play as X once you're almost halfway through the game, and playing as X is really no different from playing as Axel. In this game you actually have to take 2 characters with you, which means that in this game you basically have to play as Zero. He's at least somewhat useful because you can at least block enemy projectiles with his saber, and he's also pretty useful in at least a couple of the boss fights. So I would say this is one of the few games where playing as Zero isn't completely unbearable. It is annoying, however, that despite you getting 2 characters, and despite being able to switch between them, these characters share lives, which means that if one of them dies, both lose a life. This is a feature that they luckily changed in the sequel. Beyond which, playing as Axel is a lot of fun. He also has a unique feature, which is the weapon copy, which allows him to turn into enemies. There's a couple of segments in a few levels where you have to use his ability, but beyond that, I do have to say I didn't end up using it that much. I will say most of the levels are pretty fun. In fact, I think I prefer the 3D segments to the side-scrolling segments, because in the side-scrolling segments it really feels like the characters aren't moving fast enough. You would think that these sections would be way more fun, but they just feel very sluggish. In the 3D environment, at least it makes a little bit of sense because the environments are pretty generous. The camera is a bit sticky, but not awful, and I also like that they actually brought back a lot of familiar enemies from previous games in this. Also, just like in the last 2 games on the PlayStation 1, you actually save Reploids from levels, but in this game, some of these Reploids actually give you upgrades, which for instance increase your character's weapon power. This can really give you a leg up in your fights against some of the bosses. However, most of the bosses aren't actually very difficult, and most can be easily beat with just your normal weapon. So the best way that I would describe X7 is that it is admittedly very clunky, but I actually think a lot of fun. And it's a shame that Capcom didn't just iron out the few kinks in the gameplay, Because for the next game, Mega Man X8, they pretty much ditched the 3D levels altogether and just made the game into a 2.5D side-scroller. Now in this game at least you get to play as all three characters right from the get-go, and they actually made X and Axel's gameplay considerably different. However, in this game you basically want to have Axel around regardless because of his hover ability, which allows you to get through some pretty difficult spots throughout different levels. I like the boss roster for this one quite a lot, and the levels are a lot more fun, and the characters move a lot faster, which is nice. There are annoyingly 2 vehicle stages, and both are pretty terrible though. This game also introduces Metal, which is a collectible which you can use to actually buy upgrades to your characters. This game also reintroduced extra lives. Yes, the previous 4 games did have extra lives, but in the last 4 games of the series, every time you got a game over, if you chose continue, the game would basically just allow you to start from the last checkpoint in each level. In this game you have the retry chips, and when you use them you also get to start from the checkpoint. However, once you run out of them, you do have to start the level from the very beginning. This is a feature that I actually like because it did force you to actually learn how to play through the levels in a smart way. And it also made it not so easy to just tank your way through the level. The soundtrack to this one is pretty so-and-so, but the bosses are great, and I do think this game is right on par with X5. It's just overall a very enjoyable game. And those were my thoughts on the Mega Man X series. What are some of your favorite and least favorite games in this series? Drop it in the comments. I'm Hannu the Hannu Mäkinen, and see you on the next one.